Welcome everybody to today's panel, looking at the right to remedy for trafficked persons from the local to the global. My name is Jane Huckabee and I'm the director of the new International Human Rights Clinic here at the law school. And I'm really thrilled to have with us today three top officials, both top in rank and calibre, who are really leading anti-trafficking work at the international, federal and state level. So we have with us today Ms. Joy Ngozi-Ezilo, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. Welcome, Joy. We also have Ms. Alison Friedman, who is the Deputy Director of the Department of State Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. And finally, at the end, we have Lindsay Robertson, who is an Assistant DA at the Office of the DA in New Hanover County, North Carolina. So while there are many aspects of the fight against human trafficking, today's panel will be really looking at both the challenges and ways to overcome those challenges moving forward to ensure a right to remedy for persons who've been trafficked. This is an extremely timely topic, not only in North Carolina, which ranks among the top 10 states in the country for human trafficking, but around the world, where countries are increasingly introducing new laws against trafficking, where there's an increasing recognition that trafficking is a human rights violation, but somehow there still remains a big gap in implementation and a big gap in providing services to people who've been trafficked and providing them with their legal entitlements. Against that backdrop, one key and frankly sort of monumental effort that Joy is undertaking is to develop a set of UN basic principles on the right to an effective remedy for trafficked persons. These principles are the first of their kind. They're much anticipated by governments and human rights advocates around the world to really provide an overarching normative framework for how governments, including the United States, should be designing their legal and other response to trafficking. I'm very excited that the International Human Rights Clinic here will be working with the rapporteur and her staff in Geneva to finalise those principles by the spring of next year. On that note, it's my privilege to introduce Joy to everyone, who has been the UN rapporteur since 2008. Joy, I'm not going to read your bio because it's as extensive and exhaustive as your travel schedule and your commitment to this issue. So please, I know you have a copy in front of you, have a chance to look through it. But I welcome you to Duke, to Durham, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll stand because I've been traveling so much that I'm afraid I will fall asleep. Jet lag kicks in. At times I have to pinch myself and say, where are you? And this morning I was so happy to wake up in this nice environment. I just feel like staying and not going back to New York and then just staying here to recoup. Thank you very much for having me and for inviting me to this. And I'm really excited to share these few moments about my work at global level as the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. Jane also have been a partner in that work. And then with regard to the subject matter of discussion on right to effective remedy, she was one of the experts we really got involved in the work at a very preliminary stage when we met. I convened a global consultation on right to effective remedy in Bratislava in 2010. And I'm glad that she's still with us and now have gotten even the law clinic here involved, which is great. And they are providing huge assistance to my mandate. And I appreciate that. I also thank the fellow panelists. I'll be very quick because we have a few minutes to share this experience, which is global because my work is global. I'll try to just be very brief. We are talking about right to effective remedies for trafficked person. And the right place will have been, knowing that we're all at different levels of knowledge with regard to human trafficking, is to talk about what is human trafficking then, how is this defined under the law. So I'll just try to explain that human trafficking is recruitment of person, transportation, receipt, harboring of persons, by means of through deception, fraud, coercion, abuse of power or position of vulnerability, and for the purpose of exploitation. And this exploitation include sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, exploitation for services, things similar to slavery, servitude, domestic work, removal of organs. All of these come within the ambit of trafficking. And when those means, so in terms of defining trafficking, the act, the means, and the purpose are very crucial. And when those means are used, you deceive people into work that ordinarily they would not have accepted. You deceive people and then exploit them, and they are not paid for the job they've done and their passport, and they are basically enslaved. So when that happens, of course, you know ordinarily that the person has suffered some injustice. They've suffered harm. They've been exploited. Their human rights have been abused. So human trafficking is about people whose basic human rights have been violated, including right to decent work, to earn a livelihood, right to live free from violence, because some of the women who are violated are forcefully raped, forced into prostitution. People are forced to work as domestic workers, never see the outside world, doesn't have, even are not allowed to eat properly, not to talk, even to shower, or not to talk about earning a livelihood. It's about women, girls, boys, men who are trafficked into different sectors in the world. Some is also stratified. It has gender dimension because you find women mostly in the traffic into the sex industry, also trafficked as domestic workers, also trafficked as in the service industry in general, sweatshops. And you find men trafficked into agriculture, construction work, fishery, and then for children, mainly child labor, bonded labor, and all of that. So it is, and also a bit of sex trafficking. People can never, when they are under 18, they say consent. People can never give consent to be trafficked. They have some people arguing that they've consented. I don't think anybody gives consent to trafficking. But here you have some gray areas around the smuggling and trafficking. And when people pay smugglers, migrant smugglers, to smuggle them to a place, the situation can even quickly change from smuggling to trafficking. Then back to the issue of injury, and then this sense of justice, that even in law, every harm ought to be remedied. So that's the foundation. If someone has suffered an harm, injury, that injury, he or she must get some remedy. And why remedy for victims of trafficking? It is so crucial. When we look at the push and pull factors, the root causes of trafficking, you know that people, if you don't also provide remedy, they are more likely to be re-trafficked and re-victimized. So what are the problems with trafficking? Why are they not getting this remedy? For example, we know trafficking is a huge business out there, and traffickers are making huge amounts of money exploiting people, that people work for years without earning income. They would deserve an income. Remedy is already, right to effective remedy is already something that is a standard that is virtually in the normative framework is very clear at international law, that almost every major international instrument, whether you're looking at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, CEDAW, and the regional instrument, Africa, Europe, they all talk about right to effective remedy for cases of violation of human rights. And for me, my work in human trafficking is also focusing on human right-based approach. So those standards are germane and relevant and imperative for the work I do. Actually, my framework for combating human trafficking is hinged on 5 Ps, 3 Rs, and 3 Cs. And when you look at the 5 Ps, I hope you get that. I'm not exhausted with the alphabet, so more ideas on the alphabet to use after this rest. But then the first P is about protection. Just get it, protection. People have to be protected, both under the law, the victims. The next P is on prevention, preventing human trafficking. It's an area we're still not doing enough, but another talk for another day. Then the issue of prosecution, prosecuting traffickers so that we can stop the impunity of human trafficking. Then you have the 4th P, punishment. not just desire. Punishment is meant to serve as, to dissuade, effectively dissuade people from trafficking in human beings. And some we see that here, some people trivialize the offense. Sometimes traffickers are convicted for even pimping, asked to pay a fine, and sometimes there is no law, adequate law at national level to prosecute them, and they just let them go. Then the fifth P is about promotion of international partnership. Because when you talk of trafficking, a country can be a source country, transit country, destination country. And in all of this, trafficking knows no border. And no one country can combat it alone. You need partnership, including public-private partnership, because now businesses are involved as well. So the 3 R's quickly is where also my talk will be centered. And I'm being warned, the time is already up. It's almost getting there. It's on 3 R's: redress, recovery, reintegration. And the 3 C's about capacity, coordination, and cooperation. Then back to the 3 R's, which is about redress, recovery, and remedy. That's what we're talking about in terms of right to effective remedy for victims of trafficking. What are those substantive rights to remedy? Then we're thinking of restitution, compensation, recovery, satisfaction, guarantee of non-repetition. And the challenge is not in just recognition of this substantive right, but about the procedural right that will enable people to assess justice and to get remedy. That is where many countries have problem, and from my work that I've seen problem. Procedural right as such as right to information. For even trafficked person to know that their rights have been violated, and these are the options, and this is the way they can seek for redress. That information, is it available in the language you understand, bearing in mind that people are trafficked from one country to the other, where they may not even be able to communicate in the same language, not to talk about knowing about complexities of laws in that country. Then the issue of lack of resident status. If you are an irregular migrant, even involved in what is classified as an illegal work in a country, like people forced into prostitution, how do you begin to assess remedies if you don't have a status, legal status? If you are involved in work that is not considered legal, then there is also the issue of the options available to people, because civil proceedings, when they can look for compensation, can be very expensive, time-consuming. And if trafficked persons are not even identified, the greatest challenge is that some of them are not identified. And for you to be able to assess remedies, it has to start with identification. If they are not identified, they are likely, and this I've seen. I was in a recent mission to Italy. Everywhere I go to detention centers in a country visit, and people at detention centers, enough screening has not been done, no protocol, and some of them, when you started talking to them, you discover they are trafficked person. If they are not identified, then they are arrested, detained, and deported, and they wouldn't have any opportunity for seeking remedy. And also, remedy compensation is hinged on identifying a trafficker. And if you don't get that, then they may not be able to assess a remedy. Then there is also a problem in criminal proceeding that for some, they cannot even ask for compensation during prosecution. But in many countries, this is also changing. They are able, but there are difficulties. Who will pay even who will redress the wrong? State will say, we didn't cause the trafficking. Yes, some other person did. Should state be liable? These are issues. And I think they should also be liable to pay compensation. I think recent thing that happened in Ohio was now they are talking about state parliament paying compensation for those women who were abducted for a decade. So these are the kind of issues that is out there that is causing problem. So many people who have suffered, who have never earned income, shouldn't they have a right to get those income back that they've lost? Shouldn't they have opportunity to be given to recover, reflection period? Shouldn't they be given resident status on humanitarian grounds so they can assess justice? So these are some of the issues out there for victims, out there that victims, when I do my work around the world, and they're like, they don't know what next will be. Maybe in a shelter, it's needing psychological support. Some are provided by non-governmental organization. They are confused about what will be the next step. Sometimes they are returned, even when safe return is not guaranteed. I met a child in Gabon who wanted to be reunited with the family, and they contacted the mother. She was trafficked from Benin Republic to Gabon. And then she said she was so excited to talk to the mother in 3 years since she left, and said, I'm coming home finally. And the mom said, you know what? I'm a widow, and I have still 8 of you, and you're the first. I cannot cope. The situation is there. I don't want you to return. And then what do you do with this kind of people? So these are the kind of challenges, and there are many stories I can go on, but I hope that during the time of interaction, because I think it's important, that we will be able to explain this further. But I want to tell you that I have a full report on right to effective remedy, which I'm sure the link will be provided by Professor Jane if you're interested in looking at this. But importantly, the work I'm doing globally, for which I have a global consultation, even in New York tomorrow, is around the draft basic principle on right to effective remedy, which I've developed under my mandate, and which the Human Rights Council of United Nations has mandated that I have global consultations so that we can see what next steps. And these are supposed to be practical guides to states on how they can, the solution to finding effective, guaranteeing effective remedies for victims of trafficking. Thank you.
Hi. I warned Jane before the panel that I am a non-lawyer, so I will tell you things that I think are interesting, and I think the concepts are sound, but needless to say, my legal interpretation is going to be much worse than yours as students, so take that as you will. As Jane mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director of the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking. It's about a 60-person office, and it's unique in the State Department for 2 reasons. One is we're I believe the only office that's tasked with coordinating our domestic response to policy. So we chair the coordinating group of kind of the federal agencies that are looking at trafficking in persons. And also, we're the only office that issues a report that ranks other countries, period, let alone on a single issue. As the Special Rapporteur can attest, that makes us annoying and very controversial, but I think it also makes us effective. Each year the report comes out, we assess government's efforts to combat this scourge, and I think what we're really looking at is government's efforts to provide remedy, both in the form of victim protection, but also in terms of prosecuting traffickers. I also want to take a step back real quickly to talk about what trafficking in persons means, because it's frankly a terrible term that implies movement or process. And the reality when you're talking about trafficking in persons is it's no more about movement or process than bank robbery is about driving to the bank, and really focusing on the compelled servitude that's at the heart of the crime is critically important. Because when people talk about what the United States would define as trafficking in persons, they often use terms ranging from slavery to sex trafficking to forced labor to even that peculiar institution. As soon as you start carving those pieces out from trafficking in persons, you take away some of the international norms and mandates that are required of countries in protecting survivors and also in prosecuting victims. And I think it's important to understand it not out of a turf grab, but really because having that continuum is helpful. I mean, sometimes I think it's more helpful to think of the flip side of the right to remedy, which are the zones of impunity that get created when you're not looking at that entire continuum. And my experience, I think one of the places that is most interesting on this issue right now is how governments are interacting with businesses related to trafficking in persons. When I first started working on this issue, I was working in California. I was running a little NGO, and we would go and we would talk to companies that were actually forward-leaning on social justice actions, both in their supply chain and philanthropically. And invariably, when we would talk to the best companies that were engaging actively in the issue, we would say, "This is great. Can we broadcast what you're doing?" And they would say, "Absolutely not." Public awareness is such that if we start talking about how we're dealing with our slavery problem, we become the only brand with a slavery problem. And I think in their silence came the opportunity for other companies to continue doing exactly what they were doing in their supply chain. And so the NGO I was directing at the time proposed this piece of legislation that's been called Diabolically Clever, that basically required companies to do nothing but say what they were doing. So it's called the California Transparency Law, and companies have to say what, if any, policies they have on slavery and trafficking and whether it's audited by a third party. To come into compliance with that bill, you can say, we don't care, we do nothing, and no, we're not going to audit for it. And so it passed the Democratic legislature, and it was signed by a Republican governor. And I kept getting these calls from kind of these institutions saying, look, we have to oppose this bill, these trade associations, because it will leave us liable for other laws we're breaking. And as a flip, arrogant NGO executive director, I said, not my problem. And then I moved to the federal government and began to understand, look, the Department of Labor issues a list that says these are the goods that are produced with forced or child labor, and this is where they come from. The United States Congress amended its law in 2008 to say, no longer is the criminal standard knowingly profiting from sex trafficking, but it's knowingly profiting from sex or labor trafficking, either knowingly or in reckless disregard. And oh, by the way, the civil standard is negligence. So now if you're a multinational company in California that says, look, we do nothing, and you're using these goods, I think there's an opportunity there. And again, I'm not a lawyer. Simultaneous to that, we come into the government and we're seeing what I think is one of the most challenging aspects of the modern manifestation of this crime. A lot of what are called receiving countries increasingly relying on third country nationals for their labor, and sending countries increasingly relying on third country national remittances for an ever increasing percentage of their gross domestic product. And so for the first time in 2 centuries, there are now countries with vested economic interests in the perpetuation of this exploitation, and invariably they point fingers at each other. Look, it's not our fault. They were exploited with the unscrupulous labor recruiter in the sending country. They arrived here with the debt. What can we do? It's not our fault. They're being exploited over there. What can we do? And of course, the people who have only themselves or their family to put up as collateral fall through those cracks. And we as the federal government had to address this, frankly, because of third country nationals supporting troop movements in Iraq and Afghanistan, other areas as well. But we were hearing about contractors, subcontractors who were saying to people, look, we have this great job for you in Dubai. And all you need to do is get yourself to Dubai, and the world is yours. And of course, they have nothing to put up but collateral. As collateral, they take out a loan, they fly through Istanbul. Lo and behold, the job has disappeared, and they can go home. But of course, the people they owe know where their family lives, or they can go to Iraq and Afghanistan. And while the United States government wasn't involved in that process, we're creating that demand, and we're creating that supply chain. And so one of my proudest moments at the State Department was working on this executive order where President Obama basically said, look, if you're a contractor for the U.S. government, you are responsible all the way down your supply chain. And here's what that looks like, and I can go through more details later on that. Because I want to just end, one of my favorite leaders in the field is this man, Gary Haugen, who talks a lot about this needless wistfulness of the past and wondering if you would have, marched with Martin Luther King or fasted with Gandhi or stood at Seneca Falls, and that really there is this great human rights issue of our time now that everybody can be involved in. And when I look at all of the change that I think we've wrought over the last 13 years, the reality is we're still hitting less than 0.003%. We're still identifying less than 0.003% of victims, prosecuting still fewer, and the protections that the special rapporteur we're mentioning are available to almost no one. And I think that's an incredible opportunity for you. And I think there are awesome ways that the law can be used to leverage really systemic changes. So just to tick off a few before I run out of time. Yes, we need direct legal services to survivors, which is critical, related to both criminal procedures and vacating their verdicts. But also, we continue to hear that states have good trafficking laws, but they are never used because there aren't any good jury instructions. We need trial attorneys to take up the cause of those companies that are disclosing what they're doing and not doing enough and push them. But also, and I think more importantly, ultimately, is the defense attorneys to start saying, look, you're really vulnerable if you don't do this. And I've seen good lawyers go in-house and change procurement practices, both in terms of goods, but also hiring. I think one of the things that we continue to struggle with in the movement is people will give their charitable money, but nobody will give jobs to people who have been trafficked. And I think I just want to end on a quick story. When I first started working on this issue, I went to the UN and I asked the people who established the Global Fund for AIDS, because the funding on this is so pitiful. I said, I want to do what you guys did. Just give me the roadmap and we'll implement it. And they said, here's the difference between us and you. Powerful people had loved ones who were dying of AIDS. If you are a trafficking victim, by virtue of your situation, the only people in power you are connected to is your trafficker. And I think that the law can really be that connective tissue. So I look forward to your questions.
Thanks. I'm Lindsay Robertson. I guess I'm your local person. I went to a law school a little ways up the road. You won't hold that against me. I told Jane and Allison and Joy when I got here that when I studied for the bar, I studied for the New York bar, and the only place that they offered that class was here. And so I got to drive to Duke every day. And my friend and I found a parking space that we thought was hidden, and we thought we were clever. And our car had a sticker on it that identified us as students from up the road. And one day we got here and we found that our parking space had been painted over. And it was no longer available, but I won't hold that against you either. I guess I come to you by way of New Hanover County. I'm an assistant district attorney there now. I've often been asked if I'm the fastest Southern talker, so I will try to slow it down. I had the privilege of working with victims in New York as a corollary pro bono working at Skadden Arps as a civil litigator, but they're very good about allowing you to do pro bono as long as you're cool with not sleeping. So I got to do that and really open my eyes to what trafficking was, became very passionate about it, so passionate about it that I wanted to do that kind of work full time. And so I moved back to my home state of North Carolina, had a great opportunity to join the DA's office in Wilmington, who doesn't like to live at the beach. And so really, I guess what I want to talk to you very briefly about is the legislation that was passed during the long session in the General Assembly. And it sort of got swept under the rug because I'm sure, as many of you noticed, that there was a lot of legislation that came out of this session that was not, popular and very controversial. And this was my first stab at drafting legislation and going to the General Assembly and lobbying and arguing. And it was very frustrating, but it was also a great learning experience. As a district attorney, I learned very quickly, as the others have said, that our ability to identify victims in North Carolina and the remedies for them and the opportunities for prosecution are basically nil. You know, when you talk about pimping as a misdemeanor, you talk about prosecuting 16 and 17-year-olds for prostitution, we have a problem, right? And so we really wanted to address that with the safe harbor legislation, which I basically just plagiarized. So I can't get any credit really for the creativity here. Most of what we stole from was Washington State and Illinois. We got to learn from their mistakes. Illinois has been through 3 versions of their safe harbor, so we got to take the 3rd version and build on that. But really, I saw the bill as having 3 functions from the very beginning. One was immunizing minors. You know, making sure that we are not prosecuting minors for prostitution. You know, the term child prostitute, you know, should sound like nails on a chalkboard to all of us, right? So this idea that 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds engage in this by choice. You talk about choice. You talk about choice for 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds too, but definitely for 16 and 17-year-olds, I thought that was like a no-brainer. I will tell you a little bit more about that experience if you have questions, but apparently it's not a no-brainer. And I was told by many people in the General Assembly, one in particular, elected official, that what about the 16-year-olds who enjoy making the money and driving the Mercedes and having this lifestyle? And I said, okay, that's like looking for a pink unicorn on Mars. You will never find it. And so that's sort of where we started, and I had no idea what an uphill battle it was going to be to get that immunization for children. And so, but I guess it shouldn't be surprising because now we're the 12th state that fully immunizes minors. So that gives you an idea. And then really, so identifying victims both on, you know, the child side, but then also for adults. In North Carolina, if you are convicted of a drug offense, first-time drug offense, misdemeanor marijuana, pot, something like that, you automatically have a right to a deferred prosecution. It's your right. As a DA, I have to offer you that. And at the end of that year, if you've done good and you've got some substance abuse counseling, we're going to dismiss that from your record. We don't want you to have this heinous drug offense on your record. We do that for shoplifters. Oh, we do that for underage drinking. We do that for negligent death by motor vehicle. I mean, we do that for all kinds of things, but we didn't do it for prostitution. So these women were coming in with sometimes a public defender, but very often just coming in and saying, I waive my right and I'm guilty. And then they end up with this conviction for prostitution on their record. And yeah, it's a misdemeanor, but I can't really think of a more heinous misdemeanor, right? When you talk about getting hired and getting a job, who's going to hire that person, right? So we worked to create now a mandatory deferred prosecution for women and men, if that happens, 18 and up charged with prostitution. We had a pilot program in New Hanover County that ran for about a year prior to it becoming statutory. And basically, we asked the women to agree to go to trauma counseling, to really try to understand the root of what's happened, vocational assessment, because many of them never completed high school. Many of them were recruited before high school was complete. And then, if they need it, a substance abuse assessment, chemical dependency treatment, if that's something that's going on, but it's not always something that's going on. And then at the end of the year, that charge is dismissed. And so that's something with the pilot, we ran about 6 girls came through the pilot in the year. 5 of them are still, even though their charge has been dismissed and they're eligible for expunction now, they still want to go to counseling. They're still involved. They're still invested. I had one girl call me and say, can you come fake arrest me? Because as long as my pimp thinks I have to go to this thing because the court's mandating me to, then I get to go. So can you fake arrest me? Because I'm not quite ready to break away yet, but I will. So we see that it's like working, right? Like in this way. And so now it's statutory across the state, but the problem across all the jurisdictions is going to be creating that program, creating access for these women, partnering with, you know, if it's your local rape crisis or if there's a nonprofit specific to this type of victim, then they can offer that. But it's going to take collaboration between law enforcement, prosecutors, and nonprofits and advocates. And you can imagine there's some tension there. And then finally, and really with the bill, the last thing was confronting demand. Like I mentioned, you know, pimping being a misdemeanor is a problem. We had our first conviction for sexual servitude in Cary in May. Tony Williams, you can look him up. And he was a young guy, very common. You know, pimping is for young guys. You know, we think of this idea of like this older man coming in, but very often they're these guys in their 20s because they're the ones recruiting the girls as their girlfriends, you know, their teenage girlfriends. And this guy had no criminal history, so he didn't have any criminal history points for us to, you know, look at when we're sentencing. And at that moment, it was a Class F felony. So he got probation for sexual servitude and walked out the door. And so now with the new law, it would be a much higher class of felony. He would have mandatory jail time, and he'd have to register as a sex offender. You know, that's one of the changes in the law. Also, too, with corporate responsibility for pimping, we redrafted and rewrote the people who could be held liable for it, and that will include businesses, hotels that continue to allow it to happen, you know, massage parlors, places that, you know, recruit or just allow it to happen under the auspice of their corporation, and that was a misdemeanor, and now that's a felony. So hopefully that encourages more digging on law enforcement's part, more prosecution on the prosecutor's parts. But the reality is, when you pull victims out of those situations, we're talking about remedy, what do you do with them? How do you help them? And we have a safe house in Wilmington. It's the only safe house in the country that serves pregnant and parenting victims of human trafficking. And I was just on the phone with one of the girls on the way here, and she's like, I want to move out. I hate this. I can't do rules. I got to go somewhere else. I just can't do this. Can you come talk to me? And I'm like, yeah, I'm driving to Durham to talk about you. But, you know, it's a constant struggle, even when there are services, to provide services that are culturally appropriate and just appropriate for what these women and girls and sometimes boys have gone through. So just thinking about that, and the estimate was, and I think this has not changed so much, in 2011, I think there were 150 beds in America for victims of trafficking. So many of these girls and boys who were the 16 and 17-year-old child prostitutes being charged with prostitution were ending up in youth detention centers. They were ending up in juvenile hall. So their first interaction with law enforcement is, as you can imagine, exactly what their exploiter told them it would be. They have been arrested, they have been penalized, they have been criminalized, they have been vilified. And so by the time they encounter, you know, the first kind face, whether that's a prosecutor or a victim advocate or someone at the hospital, you know, as you can imagine, the trust is gone. And there really wasn't much trust to begin with at that point, when the, you know, average age of entry into prostitution in America is 13 and 14. So by the time law enforcement encounters her at 16 and 17, that's been a long 3 years, right? So just to say that in North Carolina, I think we are taking steps forward. I think this bill is a big piece of that. There are more expunction opportunities for victims. There is now mandatory restitution, as Joy talked about, the need for restitution to be paid by the offenders to them, but it also allows them, in North Carolina, there's a victim assistance fund, and trafficking victims before the bill were not specifically carved out to receive funds from the victim assistance fund, and now they can, to the extent there's funding. Allison mentioned there's not a lot of funding. And we specifically, when we wrote the bill, we didn't ask for any money because we knew we weren't getting any. We did try to seize cars. We wanted to seize cars of pimps and johns, but they told us that all seizures went to the school board, and we said, fine, you know, give them to the school board, sell the cars, like just take the cars. You know, because it's such a big deterrent. It is. I mean, you call your wife and you're like, can you come pick me up? Why not? My car's been seized. So we talk about confronting demand, and it's a big, I don't know, have you guys seen The Heat? You've seen the first scene of like The Heat where Melissa McCarthy like takes the guy's phone and like calls his wife. She's like, while she's arresting him, I'm like, that should be standard protocol. You should call them every time. Because I've been the prosecutor in a courtroom at the end of the day, and the last person sitting in that courtroom turns out to be the wife of the John who was waiting to see what happened to her husband. And I've been the one that had to tell her. So, you know, but happy to answer your questions. I encourage you to read Senate Bill 683. It is a very large piece of legislation. I had no idea. I didn't know that most legislative changes were like one line. This is 14 pages. It's sort of like my child. So I'm happy to talk with you about it. And then North Carolina in general, you know, if you have specific questions about, you know, state legislation and remedies that we have on the state, happy to talk with you about that as well. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Wow. So we have a lot to think and talk about. So we're opening up the floor for questions. We're going to take a few at a time and then have the panelists respond to them. If you could identify yourself when you ask your question, that would be great. So opening up the floor.
Hi, I'm Lilia. I'm a student here. I was just wondering how maybe each of you could speak to this a little bit, how you take into account the victims' concerns or desires in terms of fashioning remedies and responses. I think that's one of the core principles of taking a human rights-based approach to these kinds of issues. So just wondering or interested in hearing kind of about that.
Chad.
I just want to ask a question about how important it is that the prosecution focuses on trafficking as opposed to a lot of other crimes. When we hear, it's prostitution or some other offense and forced servitude, but often the label trafficking isn't there. Does that create problems when we come to the point where we need remedies? These victims can't say, I was a victim of trafficking. And if so, how do we fix that?
All right, we'll take one more and then responses, yes.
I'm Sarah, I'm a 1L, and I was wondering as students still, what we could do now to start helping, like if it's awareness or you need more people studying a certain type of law or what kind of thing we can do.
Great. So I have 3 questions, one around how you take into account victims' preferences in remedies, the significance of how you charge these crimes, trafficking or otherwise, and then what can we do? So open up for, does anyone want to jump in on the first question about victims' preferences?
Yeah, I can start with the preferences, yeah. From my experience at global level, it's not one size fits all. And we don't recommend, because victims are different, even as much as you have a broad standards and that you want to see implemented. But again, you have to look at each individual case and then tailor what will be most suitable to them. Take, for example, as part of the remedies is the issue of restitution. And restitution, when you look at it, it means restoring a person in the position they were before they were trafficked. You will see this type of remedy may not work for all victims, because for some, taking them back to the situation might be worse and further jeopardize them and also make them also vulnerable for re-trafficking. Again, just look at the case I narrated about the girl in Gabon. So if they manage to send that girl back, the next available caller, trafficker, the mother is going to give her away again. If it's marriage, survive marriage, first, anything, it's going to be. So it wouldn't work for, say, okay, restore her, take her back home, because safe return may not work. So you have to look also at that possibility. For some also, you will see that maybe what they need, that's why, in fact, it's important to have a reflection period, a recovery period, a reflection. That's when they go through, try to come to terms with what they've gone through, and then work with psychologists who can provide that kind of that support, psychosocial support, for them to reach a decision. Then you give them options, about a range of options, what is available to them, and then they will make the choice finally. But again, if you don't give them enough time, some of them, once they are found, say, I want to go home, take me back home. So they don't even assess these remedies, and they are not explained to them. You have option also to maybe get compensation and seek compensation in the country, or even to get a stay, because maybe the country laws allowed already identified victims of trafficking, like in the U.S., to get a status, a legal status. So they just go back without even, because all they want then. Or if you emphasize a conditional assistance, you must cooperate with law enforcement officers. And if that is strictly interpreted, and then it means that depending on their situation, they're also not ready to tell on their traffickers. Because some of them are facing reprisal attacks, threats. So, and some have gone into voodoo. There are people who take them through some fetish thing, voodoo, so where they swear they can never tell on their traffickers. Very typical of some of the people trafficked from Africa, and especially Nigeria. So they will take all their personal effects. They will never talk until maybe you assure them they retrieve those things from the native doctors, and then you see them heave a sign, and they will, even the psychology of it keeps them depressed, and they think they are sick or going mental. And once that is sorted out, then, so you have to weigh in a lot of options. But what we are saying, let them be aware, right to information of those available. Let them have the assistance, shelter, medical, psychosocial support, and then they would make an informed decision based on those options. Thank you.
Sure, and just a couple of quick things. I think it's very important to take into account individuals, survivors' desires and direction in terms of their own recovery process, but also, we like to say at the State Department and USAID, nothing about them without them. The survivor voice being included in policy decisions is critically important as well. One of the things that we have covered in the last 4 trafficking in persons reports, and unfortunately will continue having to cover, is how many shelters as a general practice lock their doors and force survivors then into shelter and then prohibit their ability to work around the world. And if survivors can't work to earn a living and are being held against their will, it's not really freedom. And I think another kind of core policy issue related to this is how you respect a survivor's desires for their own privacy or to tell their story, and give them the time, as the special rapporteur was saying, to really reflect on and understand what they're committing to, and not push survivors to prematurely tell their story or step in front of the media in a way that may well have adverse consequences for them later, but also conversely, for some people that's part of the healing process.
After you, I might come in on the issue of what students can do, but maybe you want to take the law one, the one on the prosecution.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of tag off of that, I think it is different for all the victims. I will tell you that you never know what it is going to be that gets through to someone, like that moment that you have with them. For one particular girl I was talking to recently, the psychology, as a special rapporteur said, the psychology of the victimology, the sort of Stockholm syndrome, the can't leave, the trauma bonding, that is just so permeated, especially in American sex slavery. I mean, that's what I see so much with pimp control. One of the girls I was talking to, it was like talking to a brick wall. Her mom in our community actually was... her mom was like the special aide to a very, very prominent woman in the community. And so her terror was that her mother was going to find out that, this had happened to her, that she was a prostitute. And she had this old conviction on her record from when she was like 19. And she said, I can't do anything. I can't get a job. I can't get into school. There's nothing I can do. And when I told her, I'd been talking to her for like 3 hours. And when I said, what if I told you there's a law that would allow you to get that conviction expunged? And it just broke. Like, that was the moment where she was like, are you serious? Like, I could be a real person again. And that's not the truth for everyone, but for her, that was her stronghold. Like, that was the thing that was keeping her from moving forward. So it's different for everyone. And like Allison said, when you talk about what's good for the victim, you talk about prosecution, victim-centered approach. And we say if it's not good for the victim, it's not good for the prosecution. And that is a really, really hard thing for a lot of prosecutors to swallow. That is a really hard thing for law enforcement to swallow, because they just want to hammer it, And I'm a hammer. I've been told that, recently. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and she's a hammer. So I am, but not in the sense of like with these women, the patience that it requires to get them to tell their story. The average is that it takes 7 times of someone telling you the story of a sexual assault to get the whole story. And you all are in law school, and you can imagine the nightmare that causes for discovery, that I have to turn over to the defense because the story's changed 7 times. Yeah, it's really rough. But when you talk about the prosecutorial decisions of, do we indict for trafficking, do we indict for pimping, do we indict for money laundering, what do we do? I recently learned in North Carolina, I think one of the reasons that our numbers are so skewed for how many potential sex trafficking cases or labor trafficking, any kind of trafficking cases, there's an IRB code there for law enforcement, and there is no code for trafficking. So when those numbers get coded in for law enforcement, it's always going to say prostitution or something else, but it's not going to say trafficking. And I think that's, one of the things that skewed our numbers. And then just sort of not knowing the law that's available from the law enforcement point of view, like Allison was talking about, this terrible idea that it requires transportation or it requires kidnapping, or we can't charge it in New Hanover County because the only piece of the crime that happened here is the recruitment. So going and doing law enforcement training and letting them know, well, as long as one element of the crime took place here, we have jurisdiction. We can prosecute that. So I think those are things that will be helpful. And then also, my sort of philosophy, and I was helping someone in Brunswick County last week work on their indictment. They had a girl who 2 men had gone and bailed her out of jail. She was 16 years old. They bailed her out of jail and then started exploiting her, prostituting her on Backpage and Craigslist, because Craigslist is now back up and running apparently. And they said, well, we're going to charge them with sexual servitude. And I said, well, why not charge them with recruiting? And they're like, well, we don't know if we can prove recruitment. Really? So what was the intent, do you think, when they went to the jail and bonded out the 16-year-old? Do you think that they were transporting her for the purpose of? And now under the new statute, or in reckless disregard, that this might happen. Specific intent is not the only intent that's allowed or prosecutable anymore. We've allowed in reckless disregard so that we can start getting the Johns too. Because if you're visiting someone who's 16, 17, or looks like they might be, you now could be charged for the trafficking as well as the solicitation, because mistake of age is now statutorily no longer a defense that's available to you. So understanding what the law is, and when I explained that to the prosecutors in Brunswick County, they were like, oh, we can charge them with 2 separate felonies, right? Like the maintaining and the recruitment. And that's 2 separate Class C felonies in addition to everything else that these guys were facing. Because as the girls were servicing, or the girl was servicing the Johns that were coming in, they were then robbing the Johns. So they had a whole scheme. But I say that, and it's sort of sad, because I really worry that had someone not reported that they'd been robbed, like that's how they found out about that, you know, because that victim didn't identify herself as a trafficking victim. Most don't. So I think that's a big thing for remedy as well. And then you wanted to talk about.
I'll just add one thing onto that. I mean, I think the reason why it matters if you get charged under trafficking or under prostitution is under one venue you're treated as a victim and the other a criminal.
Yeah.
And that affects, you know, how you then can access relief funds and so forth too. So really the conceptualization of that is just so key as a starting point for even to be able to have a remedy available to you in these going forward. So on what students can do, apart from being in the clinic and working on these basic principles next semester.
Exactly. So I'm happy that the students working in the clinic are really contributing. And I have also similarly students from all over the place, Oxford, Cambridge, working and contributing to my mandate through their work. But I think all of us in this room need to join the fight against human trafficking, or trafficking in human beings, or trafficking in person, or modern-day slavery, as you may wish to call it. We need to act. We need to act, and then begin by informing ourselves very well. Begin by changing our attitude about how we stigmatize some people. Okay, oh, these are traffic people. Oh, these are prostitutes. You know, they are willing. They must have consent. These are people who they are from this place, or they are from that place. They are irregular migrants. They are illegal migrants. They are taking up the jobs. Yeah. So because all of this stigma also means that this goes underground, and people never want to talk about their victimization, including men, or to think, okay, trafficking just affects women and in prostitution. It is beyond that. We need to buy responsibly. We need to also demand accountability, because now as consumers, consume responsibly, buy, because some of the services we buy, some of the things, products we buy are made also from people who have been exploited. So we need to ask questions. We need to demand accountability from our government when we see that things are not going the way it should go. Importantly, we need to use new technologies to inform. These are channels that young people use. These are channels that they communicate with. If today you can tweet about this seminar, I mean, it's not very cool to tell people that you've attended a seminar on human trafficking. They say, what are you talking about? Maybe if you have attended something that is cool, but please make it a point to tweet about this and say, yeah, I didn't know this human trafficking is because sometimes, my name is Joy, but I don't think it gives so much joy to talk about this ugly phenomena. You can't afford to just smile unless you see a victim is restored, is smiling. You brought succor to them, they've been rescued. So it's a hard subject. But please tweet about it today. Write about it in your Facebook and say that this is real and that you've learned something, and maybe your friends can ask you a question on this, and you can also better educate them. Because really, I tell you, traffickers are using new technologies to lure the people, to prey on people. I was in Dubai, UAE. I was doing a country visit last year, and I met this girl from Colombia. She was enslaved for 3 years in UAE. And you know what happened? Between her and the computer, there was no go-between. It was that she got saw this job offer. We all Google, we all search, and she's looking for a job. She's a graduate. Oh, fantastic. You mean I can do this? Yeah? Interpretation services, I can do this in Dubai? Fine. And she jumped at it. And this is e-technology, everything. So you get your e-ticket, you get your e-visa, so you don't require to anybody physically. Oh, you get visa on arrival. Everything is arranged. You email of ticket, and then she arrived. She passed through immigration. She got picked up at the airport by the traffickers, and that was it for the next 3 years. She was found accidentally by police. She was just locked, enslaved, forced into prostitution, servicing men, sometimes several, up to 20-something a day. I met her. She spoke to me one-on-one. The same way with someone who ended up in Australia from Philippines to be harvested organ. My report on Friday to the UN is on removal of organs for purpose of trafficking for the purpose of removal of organs. So these things are happening, and they are real. So we need to know, we need to get involved, we need to talk about this. Thank you.
I'm going to take one more question and
Sure.
add on to, sorry, behind and then Rachel after. You.
Hi, I'm Hania. I just wondered if you could speak about the conflation of sex trafficking and sex work with trafficking, and how the legal response to trafficking is influenced by states such as the U.S.'s use of national and international protocols to achieve ideological goals of ending prostitution or border control.
Great. One more question, Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. So my question is sort of like twofold. First is I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on preventative measures that are currently being implemented, as well as enforcement of existing laws or policies to deal with the facilitation or demand side, since we're mostly been talking about victims, particularly with regard to corruption of local law enforcement or border patrol.
Great. So the first question is around conflation of sex work and trafficking, and then a question around prevention and demand. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I can take the one on confliction is huge, but I will also encourage you to read my report on demand and my report on prevention, and she can provide you the link because I discuss it exactly. But really my position in my work is I try to adopt human rights-based approach. First, in confliction, yes, it is existing confliction of sex work and sex trafficking, and or even call it prostitution because some don't recognize its work, and sex trafficking. But we have to be very clear, not every case of prostitution is a case of sex trafficking. That is clear. But in some, there are two different school of thought or even ideology. At the one end of the spectrum is those who believe in total ban of prostitution or sex work, and they believe that if you ban it, is an anti-trafficking measure, that it will help to eradicate or curb sex trafficking. So that's a position. And then there is another position that said, no, we don't have to say ban, because for some, also sex work is also a work that they can use and empower themselves. And some have used it to train themselves, and some opted with it, and they are earning money for themselves. So then again, you have to look at it also carefully. States, of course, have a margin of appreciation in terms of deciding what law, whether to criminalize prostitution or not to criminalize prostitution. And then you have had now new trend of Nordic countries where they criminalize clients, and I think your law also here is model after that. So where they criminalize more clients and not the prostitute. But what I caution is that we have to be informed. It has to be evidence-based, this intervention, and we have to always make sure that it places human rights at the core of it, and we look at it from that lens. Because other than that, you may even drive the phenomenon underground without knowing, and you think you have taken a blanket ban that is working, and it's not working because it's really already is insidious, it's underground, and it's taking place, and it's now more difficult because people have been criminalized, also meaning they wouldn't even get option of being identified properly as trafficked person. And there have been also a few examples where people say, if you empower sex workers, and they're registered and they pay tax and they know about this issue, they are the first to tell you who is trafficked among them, because they know who is not in control and who doesn't control their resources. And then there have been few other projects around that. And who say, but for them, some is a big moral issue. They say that prostitution can never be legal work in some countries. But then we have to again think of, if a product is made likely from the services of trafficked person, or people who are held in servitude, can you say maybe ban this product totally? If people wear tennis shoe, and it's like the tennis shoe is made from people who are forced into work, including child, okay, the response would be total ban on tennis shoe. Of course, obviously, it will put off a lot of decent people working normally and earning a living through the sale of that out of work. So if you do that in converse and try to use that and say, okay, maybe people are trafficked, sex trafficking, and then because of prostitution, we have to ban it. So you have to look at it, then make a distinction. For cases of children, it's zero tolerance, okay? It can never be okay. It has to be total ban of child prostitution, I mean. You have to ban it, ban pornography, total ban. When it comes to adult prostitution, then you still have to weigh all of this and then think of, there have been interesting projects in Australia. I see how the government involved sex workers, even in their research, even in terms of preparing of their response in Australia. And it was really, working well with them, and they got them involved, and they were taking lead in intervention in that area. So we have to look at all of those options, and then it's still there for some. I think it will be also interesting because State Department have their views on that. But what I think I also like, even with in terms of even the supply chain and looking for visa even for the US, you see all those list of questions. They are very good, and they're very good. And I think also I recommend it to government. That's the way to go in terms of to ensure that people are not trafficked, or you're not involved in trafficking of people for prostitution or for any other form of exploitation.
Let's just give a 10-second response to these questions. We have to wrap up very soon.
Yes.
Reply.
Yes.
Do that. Thank you.
I'll be super quick, but I need a little bit more than 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
On your question, I think the position of the State Department is, and our diplomatic engagement is really whether prostitution is legal or illegal in the country. It doesn't obviate your obligation to find those people who are being held in compelled service in that industry. I do really want to go back to why it's important that things be charged as trafficking in persons. I think we have seen internationally that having a discrete trafficking in persons law, one, helps you better track the numbers, but also, there's a South American country that incorporates all of its labor violations into the same law. So unsanitary working conditions to slavery are charged under the same law. What that means in practice is the penalties are so small that they can be commuted to community service. So you can hold somebody in slavery, and your punishment can be buying their family a fruit basket at the end that obviates your thing. Real quickly, as far as what students can do, it continues to frustrate me that the trafficking issue, when it's clearly a crime issue, among other things, is viewed as a soft issue. And I think spending some time looking at kind of the hard sides of the trafficking issue, for the first time ever in the history of our office, we had a finance minister come in and ask what it would take to move a tier on the trafficking in persons report because it was hurting their credit rating and they couldn't get loans. I think if we could start looking at the risk related to businesses and what those policies are, there are a lot of different ways that finance and law can come together that kind of makes the concrete, quantitative arguments around the impact of this issue, and that would be really useful. Another thing is, if you haven't been to slaveryfootprint.org, I would recommend you go. It's I think as cool as trafficking gets.
Yeah.
Lindsay.
I guess I would just speak very briefly to the preventative measures in law enforcement. In North Carolina, they made it mandatory for law enforcement to now have human trafficking training when they go through basic law enforcement training, which is great. But the problem is that the newbies come out and the jaded law enforcement officers who've been for 20 years are like, oh, no, that's not trafficking. No, that's just a crack whore, okay? And they sort of get brushed to the side. So we're working really hard to make a systemic change across the state for continued in-service training. And I've been providing that in the Southeast and across the state to different agencies, like state troopers, who are very famous for their drug interdiction, but not so much for their human trafficking, because finding a kilo of coke in a trunk is like shooting fish in a barrel. But you find a 16-year-old in a car, and what do you do with her? So there's obviously some challenges there. I think corruption of law enforcement, unfortunately, does happen a lot. It does exist quite a bit. I dealt with it more directly in New York than I have in North Carolina, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen here as well. And then I would just say the last bit about sex work versus sex trafficking, just as sort of a empirical study. You may be familiar with the Swedish and the Nordic model of prostitution and what they did there. They legalized prostitution for the women. Everyone else is still a criminal. And they've done that for 13 years, and they've really seen prostitution sort of cease to exist, to the extent that now in Amsterdam, where the red light district has been so famous for so long, they're now starting to say, we think maybe we did this wrong, because we've allowed more human rights violations than we thought, and they're starting to look more to the Swedish and the Nordic model. But on our front in North Carolina, when we were fighting for immunity for those 16 and 17-year-olds, I got asked the question a lot, well, if you legalize it, don't you just make more of it, right? And I said, this isn't about legalizing anything, this is about recognizing victims. And so that's to Allison's point of, it doesn't matter, what the law says about whether it's legal or not legal. The question is, can we effectively recognize victims? And I think part of doing that is, like you said, taking a really hard look at, are we prosecuting this effectively? And are we shifting our idea and our perspective away from who the criminals are? Like, that stigma is just such a big deal with prostitution, and really starting to focus on the demand. So we say victim-centered prosecution, but we also say offender-focused. Like, what is their intent? What is their mindset? Like, let's go after that and stop asking, what did she do? What did she wear? What did she think? What did she say? What did she agree to? There's nothing consensual about exploitation. So, that would just sort of be the last thing I would end on.
Great. So I want to say thank you to the Centre for International Comparative Law and the Duke Human Rights Centre at Keenan for co-sponsoring the event. And a big thank you to our panellists for really sharing such an incredible breadth of insight into the challenges, but again, also some strategies moving forward as to how we provide a remedy for people who've been trafficked. So thank you.